the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
I don't know if you heard this or not. Congress, there are some members there, 14 House representatives, who sent a formal request to the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, asking him to invite the Pope. They want Pope Leo to address a joint session of Congress. And look, it would be a first. It'd be a historic moment, not only because he'd be the first Pope to do so as a native son of this land, but because his message could bring a message that's really needed more than ever right now. Here's what they wrote. They said, it would be valuable for Congress to hear His Holiness's vision for the role of the Catholic faith in the world and how he plans to lead over 1.4 billion Catholics worldwide and many others who look to the Holy See for spiritual and moral guidance. Just think about that for a moment. Ambassador Joseph Cella is going to be joining me, and maybe I'll get his take on this as well. But we live in a time of profound division, both politically and culturally, right? Great hostility towards the faith, especially the Catholic faith. I think it would be awesome to have the Holy Father here, to hear him. He was raised on the soil. He walked on it, to come here and speak perhaps about the dignity of life or the sanctity of marriage or a call to justice or a hope for peace. Who knows what he would say, but we've seen it before. Pope Francis made history in 2015 as the first pontiff to address Congress. Leo XIV, as an American, could speak not just as a visitor, but really a son of America. So we'll see. That has been proposed, and I'll keep you up to speed on that. But I do want to talk about the role of the Vatican in terms of bringing peace to the world. Is it possible that the Catholic Church could become a bridge to peace? I think it's one of the more beautiful, maybe often forgotten roles of the Catholic Church, especially through the papacy. It has been a peacemaker, not just within the walls of the church, but, between everything from warring bishops to warring nations. And I thought we'd talk about it. I've invited Ambassador Joseph Cella, who served as the ambassador of the United Nations, the United States, from 2019 to 2021. And he was there in Fiji and Tonga and Tuvalu and Nauru and a bunch of other places. And Ambassador Cella and his family were the largest family to serve in an ambassadorial posting overseas in the history of the State Department. Ambassador, good to have you with us.
Great being back with you, Drew. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, there's a lot going on in the world. I got your text the other day, and I wish I could have squeezed you in. We dealt a little bit with what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. The president has announced, as you probably know, that Leo XIV has offered the Vatican as a venue for peace negotiations between those two warring countries. And that came after, I think it was a 2.5-hour conversation between the president and Vladimir Putin. And he said, hey, Russia and Ukraine will immediately start negotiations towards a ceasefire. More importantly, an end to the war. The Vatican, as represented by the Pope, has stated it would be very interested in hosting the negotiations. He says, let the process begin. How likely is this? Is this the president saying, hey, this is a great idea? How open is Putin? How open is Volodymyr Zelensky to this? And what are your thoughts on the likelihood of it happening?
Well, I'm hopeful. I think that this is a stark contrast between the not too distant history of the Iraq War in 2003, when St. Pope John Paul the Great, in his direct diplomatic push, and then also through his Secretary of State Cardinal Laghi, tried to have cooler heads prevail and peace, and regrettably was not listened, and I think we paid the price as a result. However, very heartened by the fact that you have Pope Leo XIV and President Trump both looking actively and working proactively to get onto the on-ramp for peace. So this is a turn from that past failed approach where Pope John Paul pushed for peace, spoke of its imperative. However, those warnings went unheeded, and sadly it resulted in a disaster.
It'll be really interesting, Ambassador, to see what Pope Leo XIV does. I mean, in his inaugural Mass, he called for, and I'll quote him, he said, a just and lasting peace as soon as possible for the beloved Ukrainian people. And my understanding is that he's been pretty proactive. He met with key figures already, such as, I think, the major Archbishop of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. He met with Zelensky. He wants to facilitate dialogue and reconciliation for the two. But this is so complex, in terms of all the international relations. Will the Vatican just be neutral ground for them, kind of the Switzerland, if you will, of the negotiation, or do you think that the Vatican and the Pope itself will play a role in influencing some sort of dialogue and connection and peace?
Well, I think it'll be very similar to what we saw with Pope John Paul the Great and Cardinal Laghi, very proactively. Cardinal Laghi went right to the White House to meet with President Bush. Pope John Paul met directly with President Bush. So I would hope that direct engagement. I hope both a host site in the Vatican. You could view it as sort of Switzerland, but I think we should take heart in Pope Leo's early communications to groups where he says he speaks of himself as a bridge builder, and I think he'll be very intentional about that. So that is very fertile ground that I hope that the shoots of life can be born out of.
Zelensky, when the president spoke to him, he wanted a 30-day ceasefire. He proposed meeting, a meeting where Putin and Zelensky would both be there. Trump could attend, but he wanted to make sure that the U.S. didn't make any decisions about the Ukraine without, Kyiv's input. And, you almost hear Zelensky's desperation in those requests, pushing for any chance to crack Putin's armor. And of course, Putin on the other end. I want your take on these two men and how you see peace maybe coming about. Putin is not budging. I mean, he's not interested in a ceasefire. He's claiming, it would only give Kyiv, I guess, a chance to rearm and regroup, so he doesn't want to do that. He's pulled troops from China and North Korea, and, they're losing, men like crazy. It's a bloodbath, as the president said. He's holding on to his original goals. He wants to weaken the Ukrainian military and cut off its alliance with the U.S. and Europe. And some say that, he's just tapping us along. He's kind of... giving us prisoner exchanges and economic deals and gestures that look like it might be enough to keep Trump happy, but nothing has come from this. So I don't know what's next. I'd love to get your take on that. And if for some reason nothing does come from this, what do you see happening? Does this thing get larger? Does it get bigger?
Yeah, I'm optimistic, but cautiously so. I think we take great heart in President Trump's recognition. Even during the campaign on the campaign trail, he spoke of the necessity for peace, that it wouldn't have happened on his watch. I do believe that. But I would say, to answer your previous question, I think both leaders are dug in. You look at Putin wrote this thing called On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. So that gets deep. I mean, he speaks to how Ukraine is entirely the product of the Soviet era. And I know he has this vision to restore Russian to the Russian Empire boundaries and going way back. So really difficult. I mean, though you do see incremental signs of hope with the rare earth minerals deal being signed with Ukraine and President Zelensky, and you see President Putin, I would say, speaking positively about the President Trump's engagement. So I think between the Holy Father serving as bridge builder and President Trump using his muscle on encouragement and pursuit of peace, I'm thinking they will get to discussions. It's incremental, maybe far longer, and this has taken similar lengths of paths, whether it was in Vietnam or in Korea. It does take time. Ambassador Witkoff's been engaged on an ongoing basis. And certainly we saw Secretary of State Rubio and Vice President Vance in their messages, I think, building on the bridge building and extending the invite to the Holy Father to the United States. So I think there's a lot of goodwill out there, but the details and really the hard work is about to begin. But I think with the Vatican entering in, as they did 22 years ago during the Iraq War, but now we have a willing president in the United States, I think is important sign and hopefully a turning point to get people to the on-ramp to peace.
Yeah, well, if anybody could get people to the table, I think this administration probably can. And I look at the church. I was thinking about this before you came on, and I thought, okay, let's look at the church's role in all this. And I'm really happy to see this Pope being willing to mediate. Pope, I think it was Benedict XV. He was the Pope for World War I. He offered a peace note, I think, in 1917 with some points for peace. John Paul II, as you know, when the Iraq War was looming in 2003, he sent emissaries, to Washington and Baghdad, begging for peace. He said, look, war's always a defeat. And of course, the world didn't listen. Pope Francis in 2014, he hosted leaders from Israel and Palestine. We saw what happened in Cuba. And now here we are with Ukraine and Russia. The church has a history of this, doesn't it? It probably goes back much further than that as well. How does the world view the church on this? Has a unique moral authority? Do they look at the Pope a particular way, or have things changed in terms of the way the world looks at the Catholic Church and its approach to peacemaking?
I think you look at successes, and I think you look at Pope John Paul the Great when he ascended to the papacy. He walked away from the approach to the engagement of the Cold War, which was Ostpolitik, which was basically a rapprochement to the Soviets. And that did not work particularly well. So it was more of a, I think, diplomatic realism, and he was more proactive, and that worked. And he worked collaboratively, I think, with the West quietly, though pastorally, using his seat as a moral force to achieve peace ultimately. That did take time. If you consider between 78 and 89 when the wall fell, that's 11 years. So I'm hoping the timeline will be compressed. And, George Santayana or Edmund Burke, I can't remember who the quote is attributed to. When you forget history, you're doomed to repeat it. But I think that we ought not forget what happened when the efforts of the Pope were ignored in 2003. We have 1.6 to 2 million less Chaldean Catholics in Iraq, and maybe 150 to 300,000 Drew remain there, and that is a poverty. So I think it's imperative to really turn away from that history, and I think we would be looking at a different story in Iraq, and the great Chaldean people had we heeded his warnings and those of Cardinal Laghi. So
I totally agree with that. And it was, by the way, Edmund Burke who did make that statement. We don't remember the past; we're bound to repeat it. Yeah. On another note, I want your take on the Vice President, Ambassador. He had an opportunity to meet with Pope Leo. Give me your take on Vance's convert to the Catholic faith. Vance presented the Pope with a letter from Donald Trump and the First Lady, inviting them to visit the States. And, of course, Leo's from the States, as everybody knows. I think he also gave him a jersey, Chicago Bears jersey as well. But what do you know about that exchange, and how likely is it that the Pope will make a visit here to the States?
Gosh, well, it was really a beautiful first upon first, where you had the first convert to the faith in the executive branch sitting with the cradle Catholic Secretary of State, working for the good and witnessing for our faith and the church, and certainly the Bridge of America now standing with the first American-born pontiff. So a very special moment. I think he is thus far showing, I think, great signs of inspiration and hope to the lay Catholic faithful, including leaders such as Vice President Vance and Secretary Rubio. And I think they will work collaboratively, as we've seen in the past, between the church and other civic leaders such as President Reagan.
I don't think Pope Francis ever returned to his homeland of Argentina, but I'm confident. I'm hoping this Pope will visit the U.S., and it'll be great. We'll appreciate your perspective on him as well. And I'm always grateful to talk with you, and I'm grateful for both your service and your expertise. So just thank you for being here with us today, Ambassador. It's always good to have you.
Appreciate the opportunity always, Drew.
All right, that's Ambassador Joseph Cella, giving you a look at the latest in terms of the Vatican playing a significant role in possibly bringing peace, or at least mediating a deal between Russia and the Ukraine, a lot of other developments that are now unfolding. You can join me and listen on the Relevant Radio app to The Drew Mariani Show live each weekday at 2 to 5 Central. Thanks for listening.